All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a highly critical author's analysis of Islamic source texts regarding the life and moral character of the Prophet Muhammad. We're going to look directly at specific Quranic verses and Hadith narrations to understand exactly how this author builds their case. Now, to be clear right up front, we aren't here to take sides. We're simply here to impartially explore what these historical texts actually say and how this specific critical analysis interprets them. So, the text roots its entire analysis in one major foundational premise, and that's Surah 33:21. It explicitly states that there is an excellent pattern, basically an example to be followed, in the messenger of Allāh. The author argues that because Muhammad is positioned as the absolute flawless pattern of human behavior, taking a hard look at his historical life is the most direct way to evaluate the moral framework of the religion itself. To do that, we'll structure our exploration of the author's critique into 5 key areas: the excellent pattern claim, livelihood and spoils, marriages and legal limits, Zainab and Aisha, and finally, timely divine revelations. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the excellent pattern claim. The author immediately points to verses like Quran 68, specifically verses 2 through 4, to really highlight the immense moral standards set for Muhammad. I mean, the text literally calls him a man of outstanding character. The author uses this specific Quranic benchmark to judge all the historical accounts of his life that follow. The logic here is pretty straightforward. If his character is universally outstanding, then his actions recorded in the texts should consistently reflect that high standard by any ethical measure. Moving right along to Section 2, livelihood and spoils. The author draws a really stark contrast here regarding how Muhammad made a living. On one side, we have his early life. According to Sahih al-Bukhari 2262, he worked as a humble shepherd for hire in Mecca, which is a standard, completely ethical form of labor. But looking at his later life, the author highlights texts where Muhammad actually states his provision has been placed beneath the shade of my spear. The critique argues this is a drastic shift from honest labor to relying heavily on warfare and conflict for financial gain, something that definitely contradicts modern concepts of ethical labor. To really grasp the historical texts being analyzed here, we need to quickly define 2 terms, fay and ghanima. Fay refers to spoils taken without actually fighting, while ghanima refers to booty taken through active combat. What the author finds incredibly notable is that Islamic commentators of the time commonly referred to these spoils of war as the noblest of earnings. And here is the crucial point the author makes. Muhammad structurally benefited from these raids. Surah 841 literally mandates that a 20% cut of all spoils goes directly to Allah and the Messenger, alongside his relatives and others. The author pairs this with the concept of the jizya, which was a protection tax paid by non-Muslims, to argue that Muhammad established a system where he personally and directly profited from the spoils of conflict. All right, that brings us to Section 3, marriages and legal limits. The author points out what they perceive as a massive, glaring inconsistency between the general rules established for everyday Muslims and the specific exemptions granted to the Prophet himself. Surah 4:3 clearly advises believers to marry up to 4 women, but it strictly adds that if a man can't maintain absolute justice and equal treatment among them, he has to stick to just one. Yet the author contrasts this general rule with hadiths recording the Prophet's own practice of having far more wives than the stated limit. Specifically, the number 9. Sahih al-Bukhari 5215 explicitly notes that Muhammad had 9 wives at one time, and honestly, other historical records suggest it was up to 11. The author emphasizes that Muhammad exceeded the very 4-wife maximum limit he set for all other believers, claiming that Allah gave him a specific divine exemption to do so. Furthermore, the author directly challenges the idea that Muhammad maintained that required equal treatment among his own wives. They use this fascinating hadith involving Omar, his daughter Hafsa, and Aisha. In it, Omar literally tells Hafsa not to imitate Aisha because Aisha is more beautiful and is clearly favored by the Prophet. The author uses this text to argue that Muhammad blatantly favored Aisha, completely contradicting his own Quranic command to treat multiple wives with absolute equality. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, Zainab and Aisha. The author lays out the Zainab narrative in a step-by-step sequence to highlight a very specific pattern. First, Muhammad's adopted son, Zayd, marries Zainab based on a divine decree. Second, the text indicate Muhammad later sees Zainab and subsequently Zayd divorces her. Third, a remarkably timed new revelation comes down that marries Zainab directly to Muhammad. And finally, to validate all of this, the Quran officially abolishes the pre-Islamic cultural taboo of marrying an adopted son's ex-wife.
It's really worth looking at the text of Surah 33:37 itself. It says, "We married her to you in order that there not be upon the believers any discomfort." The author suggests that a divine decree was utilized here specifically to personally resolve the immense social scandal of Muhammad marrying his own adopted son's former wife.
Then, the author shifts focus to Aisha, pointing to the number 6. According to Sahih al-Bukhari 3896, Muhammad actually married Aisha when she was just 6 years old, and he consummated that union when she was 9. The author highlights this historical text to directly question the whole excellent pattern narrative, pointing out just how drastically this reality clashes with our modern ethical standards regarding the protection of children. And that brings us to the final part of the author's critique, Section 5, Timely Divine Revelations. The author compiles these specific Quranic exemptions to build their central thesis. Think about it. Muhammad was allowed to marry his adopted son's ex-wife. He was completely exempt from the 4-wife limit. He was permitted to take wives without a dowry. His wives were explicitly forbidden from ever remarrying after his death. Even guests were divinely commanded not to linger in his home after a meal simply because it annoyed him. The author argues that Muhammad consistently received these exclusive privileges that were completely unavailable to his followers. The author's analysis goes even further, suggesting that even highly private domestic disputes were resolved by divine intervention. They reference the historical context behind Surah 66, where Muhammad was allegedly caught with the maid, Maria, by his wife Hafsa on her designated day. Miraculously, the subsequent verses absolved Muhammad of the oaths he had just made to his wives to appease them. The author sees this as a clear-cut example of divine mandate being used to resolve personal conflicts. Now, Aisha's own recorded observation here is incredibly notable. When a revelation came down allowing Muhammad to just ignore the rotation schedule of his wives and sleep with whomever he pleased, Aisha literally said, "I feel that your Lord hastens in fulfilling your wishes and desires." The author argues this perfectly encapsulates their most radical thesis, that in these texts, the deity constantly appears to be at the personal service of the prophet. Essentially, the author suggests this dynamic effectively makes the prophet the driver of the divine will, rather than the other way around. The author then powerfully juxtaposes all those personal exemptions granted to the prophet with this incredibly stark observation from Aisha regarding regular believers. After seeing a woman bruised green from a beating, Aisha states, "I have not seen any woman suffering as much as the believing women." The critique uses this to highlight a severe, undeniable disconnect between the lavish privileges enjoyed by Muhammad and the harsh, brutal realities faced by regular female believers under the system he established. So, we've looked at the excellent pattern claim, his reliance on spoils, the marital limits he exceeded, the relationships with Zainab and Aisha, and the incredibly convenient timing of his divine revelations. Ultimately, the author weaves all these threads together to suggest that these traditional records depict a figure whose personal desires heavily influenced the religious framework he established. And that leaves us with a truly profound question. When we study these historical religious texts, how do we interpret the fine line between divine mandate and personal convenience? The author's critique challenges us to step back and ask, did a divine framework shape the prophet, or did the prophet's personal desires shape the divine framework? Thank you for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.